Okay, welcome back to the part two of the Politiscales test. So I had a bit of a problem, and that's that I closed off my computer, and the test completely restarted, and it seems like all of the questions re-scrambled. And so I'll have to start by taking the uh, quiz all over again, but I will not spend much time on the questions that I've already gone through in the previous live stream. It is merit that explains the difference of wealth between two individuals. I think by and large, yes. Of course, you could say that like some people are born more into wealth and different things. But I think that the biggest contributing factors, whether you're a successful businessman, is like how hard you're willing to work, how much risk you're willing to acquire, and how self-driven you are. Um, and so when I think of like the world's richest people, whether it's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, or Bill Gates, like many of these people are not that they started off poor by any means, but they started off fairly middle class to upper middle class. And of course, if you have capital, then it's easier for you to invest and essentially take on risk and take those business decisions. Um, and there's also like you know type of an innate aspect to this. Um, you know, for example, I am from Norway, and you could say that I'm not entitled to live in a country that is as wealthy and prosperous as Norway. Right, like me personally, I didn't do any work to deserve this, but that's a product of my ancestors. And if essentially who is more deserving than me to essentially live in this prosperity that they created, if it was impossible for people to create prosperity for their descendants, they would probably be less inclined to work hard and produce things for society. And so it's absolutely important for society that people are willing to able to impart essentially wealth and knowledge and experience onto the next generation. And so, by and large, I agree that it's merit that is the difference in wealth between two individuals. Let's just see. I will just connect here. All right. Hormonal differences can explain some differences in individual characteristics between men and women. I don't know if it's mainly hormonal differences, but there are certainly innate differences between men and women. One of the most noticeable ones are that men are more interested in things, generally speaking, and women are more interested in people. So, for example, if there's someone that goes into things like engineering or programming or things that doesn't really have much interpersonal interaction, that will generally speaking be a man. And if someone takes a job that is very highly related to, for example, the care of other people, like being a nurse, for example, then they're far more likely to be a woman. There's also other differences, like, for example, men are more disagreeable than women. Women are higher in neuroticism and conscientiousness than men. So, women are, for example, less lazy than men are. Women are more tidy than men are. And so, there's many differences between men and women in this way that where we can see really subtle and kind of large societal differences between men and women. And some of the interesting things about like the societies that kind of try to socially construct men and women to be equal is that the more a society tries to socially construct for men and women to be equal, the more unequal they become. So, for example, Norway and other Scandinavian societies are some of the most egalitarian societies in the world, with some of the fewest differences between men and women, and with fairly low social expectations of men and women. But in terms of what professions men and women go into, the gap is much larger. So in Norway, between 95 and 90% of engineers are men, compared to somewhere like India, where 40% of engineers are women. And so when you have financial stability, people are more likely to do the jobs that they are naturally inclined to do. And so I would say that the differences between men and women might not be due to hormonal differences per se, but there are definitely innate differences between men and women. And so I would absolutely agree to that. Abstinence should be preferred to contraception to preserve the true nature of the sexual act. So I guess that this is kind of talking about how the sexual act is the act of reproduction, right? And it's a purely reproductive act. I don't really subscribe to that. I'm not a believer of the Abrahamic religions. And so I will say absolutely disagree to that, because I think that there's all kinds of different reasons to engage in sexual behavior, like, for example, pleasure, which is one of the major reasons, I think. But of course, like having children and people having children, especially in today's society where birth rates are so low, is desirable, and I think that that is something that we have to work on. But I don't think that the solution for that is to advocate for abstinence. So I would absolutely disagree to that. My country must pay for the damages caused by the crimes it committed in other countries. So luckily, I am from Norway, and Norway is not a country that have committed a lot of crimes in terms of things like colonialism and stuff like that. And in terms of countries that have, like, let's say England, France, the United States, and so on and so forth, like, I believe that the damages that's estimated, or the wealth extraction from the colonies that England did, are to such a ridiculous extent that it would never be able to repay those amounts, like, in hundreds of years. So, how much money did England extract from India? Right. So it says that England extracted $45 trillion from India. Right. England GDP. Let's see. That is that is more than 10 times, 15 times their gross domestic product, right? And the budget is probably half of that. So I assume that the budget is about 1.5 trillion. So if all of the payment went to paying back just the debt to India, excluding all the other colonies, then that would take England 30 years to do, which is like just not going to happen. Like, if we're talking about a very, very small percentage, like 1%, 5% of their national product going to this, like it would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, to pay back what they did. And it's also important to keep in mind that when England and the other colonizers colonized these countries, it's not like all of those resources that they extracted just went back to England. A lot of the funds were also reinvested in the countries that they colonized to build farms, plantations, industries, militaries, and maintain law and order. And so I'm not even sure if it's fair to demand that England should repay for essentially all the wealth that they extracted. Although you could definitely argue that they should, for example, give back the things that exist in the British Museum. But then you also have cases like, for example, Egypt, where the Egyptians that live in Egypt today are not a good representation of the average Egyptian in terms of the ancient Egyptian times. And the average Anatolian, meaning the people living in Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans and so on, are actually genetically more similar to the ancient Egyptians than the modern day Egyptians. And so, like, if you're a thief, you stole this land from someone else, and the people that stole the Egyptians' lands were the Nubians that came from deeper in Africa and essentially conquered all of that land. And then I don't think that the people essentially that made all of these artifacts, that made the pyramids, that made the sarcophaguses of the pharaohs, are gone, and the people that live in this country today are not even like the direct descendants of these people. And so I don't think that they deserve that form of compensation, because they're just not the principal descendants of those people that made those artifacts. So it's of course like difficult to sift. So like I think it depends on the circumstances. If the principal descendants of like who you stole their stuff from still exist in that country, I do think that you owe them something, and the British, I think, should possibly give back to the Indians and many of their the other colonies, the things that they have that are in the British Museum. So I guess I will place rather disagree, because, as I said, generally speaking, the British and the other colonizers used a lot of the funds that they extracted from their colonies to reinvest in those colonies, build plantations, build industry. For example, Congo, after the Belgians conquered it, of course, no matter how horrible Leopold II was, they built railways, they had working telephones, they had electricity, and so on and so forth. And they had many things that they didn't have before colonization. In fact, the areas in Africa that were the most substantially colonized, like South Africa, for example, are some of the wealthiest African countries today, because the colonizers, again, they built up those industries. So I will say rather disagree, because I don't think that colonization was purely exploitative. I think that the countries that were colonized to some extent got something out of it. The main goal of a couple is to make at least one child. I answered this question last time on the last stream, and I think that yes, the main goal of a couple should be to make at least one child. That is one of the purposes, or one of the traditional purposes of the institution of marriage. As well as I think that that is something that should be encouraged, generally speaking, in society, as we have a massive problem with the the birth rate right now. So I will absolutely agree to that. Nuclear fission, when maintained, is a good source of energy. Well, I think that nuclear energy is one of the best forms of energy out there, unlike wind farms, for example, that can be devastating to nature, and solar energy, which might not be maintainable in countries like mine in Norway. Nuclear energy is a relatively clean and good source of electricity. Of course, the danger with nuclear energy is that it poses a potential security risk. Like many people have speculated that some terrorists can, for example, go into a nuclear power plant and hold that nuclear power plant hostage and essentially turn it into an atomic bomb. And so I do, generally speaking, support nuclear energy as well. It is heavily overstated, like the amount of waste nuclear power plant generally produces. And the nuclear waste that is produced by a nuclear power plant, generally speaking, can also be recycled. Like Finland has this system with their nuclear reactors where the nuclear waste produced by their nuclear reactors usually has decays, like the radioactivity decays within 100 years through a process that they do, without me knowing a great deal about this process. And so I do feel that countries, especially since we are less energy sufficient than ever before, should invest a lot into nuclear. I think it's absolutely madness what Germany has done, for example, shutting down its remaining nuclear reactor, making them more reliant on coal and gas than ever before. So I will absolutely agree with this. Insurrection is necessary to deeply change society. Well, I answered this question as well last time, but I will briefly go over it. I do think that if you want to completely change society, to have a completely different process of the state, you probably need a revolution or overthrow of the current constitution or the current government. However, I don't think that this is desirable. I don't think that it's desirable to generally like change society in this very like radical way. And I think that there's a lot of things that can be done within the legal framework that already exists. I would argue vehemently against like things like revolution and riots and so on and so forth to try to overthrow the government and try for legal change instead. And so I will absolutely disagree, although I do think that if you want to deeply change society, you do have to instigate insurrection, but I don't believe in insurrection in principle. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is necessary in order to protect from terrorist acts. So I might have answered this question as well at the previous live stream. I, generally speaking, believe in surveillance. I believe that surveillance can deter crime. like the NSA in the US and many of the surveillance corporations around in the West have deterred and stopped acts of terrorism, stopped, you know, um, acts of murder, and so on and so forth before. And so I do believe that if you want to have safety in society and deter these type of terroristic act, it is helpful to have surveillance. And if let's say you have a tyrannical government that's like authoritarian, they would probably establish some form of surveillance anyway. So I believe that surveillance, when used by a responsible government, can be a force for good, deterring violence and stopping violence in its tracks before it forms and can affect a society. And of course, in totalitarian regimes, it can be a horrible force for evil, where the regime can do massive purges of dissidents that don't agree with the regime politically. But I think that such an authoritarian regime, would establish a surveillance state anyway. And for that reason, I absolutely agree with surveillance. Humans should neither eat nor exploit animals. Well, the thing is that humans have removed many of the natural predators that existed around the world to protect our livestock. So, for example, we have hunted almost to extinction the wolf. We have hunted to extinction, for example, things like the saber-toothed tiger and the European lion, for example. And so the ecosystems that exist in Europe and much of the world cannot exist without the predatory nature and killing of animals of humans. Like, you would run into a biological overshoot. So one of the great examples of this is the Allies during World War II. They introduced reindeer to a great many islands in the Atlantic. Because they were terrified that some soldier would, essentially get shot down and get stranded on one of these islands during the World War II. And so what happened is that over time, since there were no predators on these islands, is that the reindeer population grew and grew and grew and grew, and then ran into a biological overshoot where essentially all the reindeer died because they had eaten all the food on the island and there was nothing left to eat. And so it is necessary for humans to kill and maintain animal populations in order to preserve ecosystems. And so when you're first going to kill an animal, I think you might as well eat it. And for that reason, I believe that humans absolutely should eat animals. So I will absolutely disagree with that. Changes in an individual's way of life can induce changes in society. Sure. So I think that an example that I talked about earlier is things like when the TV was invented, right? That created a tremendous societal change. And, we have now whole traditions that are oriented around the TV when we watch, for example, certain types of programming in the Christmas season, for example. Changes in an individual's life can absolutely impact society, but I don't really know what these questions mean. I don't know the political kind of angling of this question. So I guess I will just put somewhat agree. Revolutions will always end up in a bad way. So this is also one of the questions that I answered in the previous live stream. And I think that many of the revolution that has been, like, for example, the French Revolution that had many purges of the aristocracy in France, and the Russian Revolution that purged much of the bourgeoisie and many different groups in Russia. You could say that these revolution ended up in a bad way because you had massive purges of the populations within these countries. But on the other hand, when these countries had these revolutions, they got out of their traditional ways. Like, for example, Tsar Nicholas wasn't very interested in things like uh, you know industrialization of Russia. And the Bolsheviks were far more inclined to industrialize Russia and really do what had to be done, although many people starved in the early years under Bolshevism. In the same way, in under the French Revolution, after the French Revolution was over and all the purges were over, it enabled for there to be a more meritocratic society where people didn't get positions based on their titles in the aristocracy, but based on their actual abilities, which was arguably a very good outcome of the French Revolution. And the same way, you could argue that the Bolsheviks' industrialization of Russia was a good outcome, right? So it depends on what you look at. If you look at the killing of many civilians and all the purges, or if you look at the industrialization and the other social changes that happened in those societies. And so, I guess I will say, well, I don't really agree in principle with revolution. So I guess I will say somewhat agree, because I don't really see the point of revolution today, so to speak. Okay. Citizens should take priority over foreigners. I absolutely believe that citizens should take priority over foreigners. If citizens didn't take priority over foreigners, what is the point of having countries at all? And if you're not going to have countries, then people are far less inclined to, essentially work together for common goals. Like me as a Norwegian or someone in Germany or whatever is probably far less likely to pay their taxes diligently if they know that their tax dollars goes to some poor kid down in Zambia, right? We like there's been a tremendous amount of social studies on that we are happier to pay our taxes and work for things when benefits our community and us directly, right? And so I think that if you had a system where if I work or I pay taxes, then that would benefit everyone on Earth equally, it would create a system with less productivity than what we have today, because people would feel less inclined to work because they would identify less with this concept. And so I think having a state that prioritizes the citizens over the foreigners is beneficial. I think all the states should do that and strive to make the best lives for their citizens. And so I will absolutely agree with this. We must fight against global warming. Well, I think that this was one of the questions that I answered in the previous live stream as well. And essentially, I think that if that is something that's left up to Norway, for example, my nation, I don't think that that is good. Because if we have stricter climate regulation in my country, what will happen is that industry will just pack up and flee the country and move to another country that has less regulation, like China or Vietnam, for example. And so I think that is something that should be figured out internationally, in the international framework between nations. and it's not something that can be solved by my country or any country alone for that matter. And so, if it's for my country, I am strongly opposed to having climate regulations beyond that of what other countries have, because that just leads businesses to flee and actually leads to a higher carbon footprint globally, because now you're producing goods in China, for example, that doesn't have any climate regulation at all. So they spew out a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere than any factory in Norway would. And on the top of that, you also put out a bunch of climate gases when you ship it overseas. So now it's not only produced in China, but it also has to be shipped back to Norway. And so that creates a much larger climate catastrophe than what we had originally. And so again, nationally, I oppose it. Globally, I support it. So I guess I will put somewhat agree. Schools should mostly teach our values, traditions, and fundamental knowledge. I think that for people together to have a sense of community that is taught in schools through common values is valuable, because if people identify with each other, they are more inclined to work together for common goals for the community, essentially. And so I think that teaching values and traditions in school is something that should be grounded into future generations, as well as fundamental knowledge. So I don't really know what much more I can say on that, so I will just go to next and say that I absolutely agree. It is necessary to teach history in order to create a sense of belonging to the nation. Absolutely. I think that, again, goes back to the previous question, that when you teach people history and you teach them about their ancestors, you create this form of identity that is important for the community to achieve things together. And so, again, I will just say that I absolutely agree to this question. This is one of the questions that I answered in the previous stream, which is individuals who get out of prison should be assisted in their reinsertion into society, right? And I absolutely agree with that, because if you don't assist criminals when they're re-entering society, they're just going to have a horrible time, essentially. They're just going to have a horrible time, trying to find work and re-entering the community. And so if you're not there to help them when they re-enter the community, what is going to happen is that they're just going to go back to their old ways and sling drugs or something off the streets. And so I absolutely agree that prisoners should be assisted in their reinsertion into society. Transforming ecosystems durably to increase the quality of life of human beings is legitimate. I absolutely believe that humans take priority over the environment. This is something that I ran into as a problem when I worked in politics, is that people are very rarely inclined to build property. And property is like one of the fundamental problems, I think, in our time, where more and more people rent property and less people own property. And if we're going to make property more affordable, we have to build more property. And if we're going to build more property, then we're going to have to take more of the natural land in our country. And for some country, I think that that is a tremendous problem. Like if your country has very few green areas and nature zones, then you might want to preserve those nature zones and those national parks that exist. But in my country, like 2% of the land is built upon. Like we have land that we can clear. Of course, that is a tremendous process to clear the land because you have to remove the rocks and you have to remove the trees and everything else. But we can clear that land and we could build more property. And I think that that is something that we ought to do for our citizens. So I absolutely agree with this. Loans contracted by the public sector, states, regions, communities do not necessarily have to be paid. Well, I think that you're going to run into a massive problem then if you do not repay the loan. That is, like countries have a credit rating, and something that you do not want to have as a country or individual is to have a bad credit rating, because if you have a bad credit rating as a country, meaning that you default on your payments of interest or your payments on your loan, then you will be declined for future loans, and then you might not be able to see the economic growth that you want to see. For example, you might not be able to build that new airport that you wanted to build or that new shipyard. And so, as a country, it is very, very important to have a good credit rating so that you can get loans for projects that are important for your country. So there is technologically development all the time, and so in the future, for example, it might be the case that each country will have their own spaceport because of the tremendous efforts done on, for example, things like SpaceX and so on and so forth. And countries that have a bad credit rating then will have tremendous struggle trying to find essentially the credit that they need, and getting the loans that they need to build those spaceports or having these large scale projects being built. And so I absolutely disagree with that. Abortion should be limited to specific cases. So I think that I answered this question on the previous live stream, but I will quickly go over it. I think that abortion, of course, should be legal. I think that if someone really wants an abortion, that is something that they should be able to have. If someone, for example, is forced to carry a pregnancy to term, that can, for example, make that woman that's forced to carry that pregnancy to term resentful of the child. I knew, for example, a woman that was training to be an astronaut, and then she became pregnant, and she had to either choose between her dream of becoming an astronaut or saving the child. And ultimately, she chose to have the baby. She chose to have the child. But if she chose to have an abortion to become an astronaut, I think that that is completely understandable. And if she was forced to keep the child in order to and she wouldn't be able to pursue an astronaut career, that would probably have been devastating for her and probably built up a lot of resentments. However, I do believe that the amount of abortions should be minimized and that life is valuable. And so I think that every woman that goes into an abortion clinic should probably we should probably try to dissuade them from having an abortion. We have adoption deficit in the West, where we actually import babies from other countries. and adopt them. And so it wouldn't be an issue, for example, to tell this woman that, oh, we can send this child to adoptive care, or we can give you the financial aid that you need to carry this child to term, and so on and so forth, and ensure as much as possible that this is a child that's carried to term. And so I think that that is something that we should do. And so I will rather disagree, since I think that abortion, again, is something that should be minimized but should be legal. Activism in existing political organizations is not relevant to change society. Well, I do think that activism can do a great deal to change society. For example, if you don't like a business's political stance, you cannot buy products from that business, and that might encourage them to change their views on policies. So recent incidents of that is like things like, for example, Bud Light. When Bud Light hired Dylan Mulvaney to do the commercial for them, many Americans felt really betrayed, because Bud Light is kind of also seen as a sports drink, and Dylan Mulvaney doesn't know anything about sports, so it's a extremely bad fit, and they as a result saw a 20% drop in sales. And so, like, if you're an activist, if you boycott brands, or you could also go out in the street and protest, then that can definitely signal something to legislators. So I would say activism is definitely relevant to changing society. So I will say absolutely disagree. Wage labor is a form of theft from the worker by companies. So this is also a question that I answered in the previous live stream. I don't think that wage labor is a form of theft, because many of these companies would not be enabled to be established at all if you had if all companies were enforced to essentially be worker cooperatives. And if for example, let's say businesses were said that they couldn't, if they hired someone, they would have to have an equal wage with them. Why wouldn't you just be incentivized to hire as few people as possible, right? If I was looking to start a business, right, and I knew that I had to share the profit of that business with whoever I started it with, I would look to hire as few people as possible. And if I thought it would be a successful business, I would look to hire only people that are associated with me, so maybe I can get some kickbacks from them behind the books, And so I don't think that creates for an efficient economy, because of all sorts of reasons. Like, I think that groups are more risk averse, they're less likely to take risks, and individuals and kind of visionaries are much better at driving the economic factors and the economy forward and creating products. And that's what we need capitalists. And so I will say absolutely disagree. It's necessary to massively invest in research to improve productivity. I agree. I think that research in the past have brought us great improvements to life. Like, I think that NASA alone and a lot of the research that goes into physics, engineering, so on and so forth in university has created universal principles that can be used in terms of creating commodities and things that improve life for all. For example, the discovery of radio waves and and the creation of the radio and all of these different things, all of these different principles, led to the creation of the radio and the television, all of these different things. Like these products were, a product of many different scientific discoveries, as well as the people, of course, producing it themselves. And so I absolutely agree that we should spend heavily on research. We should always distance ourselves from protesters who use violence. Well, I think that violence violence is not good. Just like axiomatically, I resent political violence. Of course, there are times where violence is necessary, and this is also one of the questions that I answered in the previous stream. Where violence, for example, is necessary in terms of war, and when defending our ideals and our culture and all of these things. But I don't believe that that is something that should be used really internally between civilians in a country. I think that creates a really untenable and unstable situation. And so I absolutely agree that we should distance ourselves from political violence. Like, I find most of the people, like Vosh, for example, that many times have advocated for political violence, absolutely morally reprehensible. So I will absolutely agree with that. Nobody by nature is predisposed to criminality. Well, I think that by and large, the differences, for example, in the violence between individuals are due to societal differences between individuals. So I think it was Richard Nisbett that did a famous study called the douchebag experiment, where essentially he took a bunch of northern men and a bunch of southern men and exposed them, made them fill out this test, and then on the way back there was this guy standing close to a file cabinet, and he kind of, when they were on the way to deliver the test, kind of bumped into them and yelled at them like asshole, and the southern men became very physically aggravated, whilst the northern men kind of just shook it off and were completely normal. And so that's like a great example, because like these were both like middle class men, these were both white men, like both of the groups, and yet there were very different levels of irritation, testosterone, and physical aggravation. Another example of this is, and that is why, like, this can explain some of the difference in the homicide rate, because these different groups, again, northern white middle class men and southern white middle class men, southern middle class white men have a 4 times higher homicide rate than northern white middle class men, and that's because they have more of an honor culture. And so I think that is, by and large, is the reason why some people are more violent than other people. There's also examples from the past, like 500 years ago, Norway was a much more violent place and had rampant dueling than it is today, where Norway has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. Of course, you also have things like, for example, the warrior gene, and like you have different things that you can say that encourages people to be dishonest or be violent. But by and large, these things seem to be socially constructed. And so I will say I absolutely agree. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. So there's many different conceptions you can have of what makes someone a man or what makes someone a woman. like you have the material conception, where of course a woman is someone with an XX chromosome and a man is someone with an XY chromosome, and then you have the more like philosophical, idealistic definition, where whether you're a woman or a man is like a sum of different character traits. And then you also have like the metaphysical definition, which is like whether you have like the soul or the essence of a man, or whether you have the essence of a woman, right? And so when it comes to both like the material definition and like the metaphysical definition, you either are innately a woman or you're not, like it's built into you. And when it comes to the idealistic definition, for example, many of the trans women that want to be women will probably never be women, right? So it seems to be, generally speaking, true that you are born a woman just from observation. So I will absolutely disagree with this. We should be retiring earlier. I answered this question previously in the previous stream, but I will quickly go over it. So I don't think retiring earlier is possible, especially with the changing demographics in society, where a larger and larger percentage of the population is elderly, and a smaller and smaller percentage of the population is young and productive and producing things in society. So I had a stat from this. Let's see early. Yes, here it is. Okay. So as you can see, this is about how much average Norwegian cost the Norwegian state throughout their life. So from when you're 0 to when you're like about 25, your cost to the state, because you're taking education, you're taking school, and these institutions cost the state money, and you're in kindergarten and so on and so forth. When you're from 25 to 60, the state benefits from you and earns money of your tax dollars and your productivity, because you're out in the work market and in the private market, and you're working for the government. And when you become old, you're a massive financial burden to the state. And so when more of the population is over here, which is what is going to happen if you look at the population pyramid in any Western country, we will be able to produce less, and we will not be able to retire as early as we do today. And so if we're going to keep up with this current level of automation, unless current levels of production, unless we have massive levels of automation, then we can't afford to retire as early as we have. So for those reasons, of course, I would love for people to be able to retire earlier, but that does not seem to be pragmatically possible. And so for those reasons, I have to absolutely disagree. It's a small group that consciously and secretly controls the world. I'm guessing that this is referring to lizards or Jews or aliens or what have you, right? And I don't really buy into these conspiracies. Of course, you can say that the people in power have a lot of similarities between them, and they go to the same clubs and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that there's massive collusion between them, right? And you would really have to prove that they have some sort of large conspiracy secret agenda together, and that's what I don't buy into. And for those reasons, I absolutely disagree. This is one of the questions that I answered in the previous live stream. It is legitimate for a country to intervene militarily to defend its economic interests. So, as I said last time, I believe, like, I'm a believer in realpolitik, and I think that the current liberal framework that exists today is constructed to benefit the economic interests of the United States. So I can give examples of this. So, for example, you have the Torture Convention of Inhumane Treatment that the United States signed. But after signing this treaty, the U.S. still committed things like Guantanamo Bay, for example, and argued essentially that if we commit acts of torture, then that is not torture. If the United States does torture, then that is not torture, right? And so I think that what the U.S. has done, like you can see this in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in all of these countries. And I think that is what the great powers of the world generally do, whether that's Russia or China or the United States or back in the day UK and France, is intervene militarily on behalf of its economic interests. And then they pretend that it's because of all kinds of other reasons, like, we like democracy, humanitarian aid, this current regime is terrible, Saddam Hussein is terrible, right? And that is really not a case. That is just like a false flag, to essentially justify invading other countries. And so, while I would not like to see that countries intervene militarily to defend their economic interest, that seems to be the way of the world. That seems to be how the world has always worked. And so, from like a moral relativist perspective, that seems to be completely legitimate. For those reasons, I have to say, somewhat agree, I guess. Homosexuals should not be treated equally to heterosexuals in regards to marriage, parentage, adoption, or procreation. So, I don't know what is meant by procreation. Doesn't procreation mean conceiving children and stuff like that? So I would say that by nature, homosexuals are not equal to heterosexuals in terms of procreation. When it comes to marriage, I don't really have a problem with gay marriage. But the thing is that what marriage traditionally has been is it is an institution of family, and where you're tied to someone else in perpetuity. And marriage is no longer that institution. It's no longer a institution where you're tied to someone in perpetuity. Divorce rates are rampant more or less everywhere. In Portugal, for example, they're 90%. And so I believe that some of the problem that I find with gay marriage, since marriage is supposed to be a family-oriented institution where you get married and then you have children, is that if there's tax benefits that's tied into that marriage, then that should go to childcare specifically and people with children specifically instead, right? And so I have a problem with gay marriage if that means that gay people that don't have kids, or people that don't have kids in general, like straight people that don't have kids, gets tax benefits, because I don't think that you're supposed to get tax benefits as a married person if you do not have kids. Um, I don't see the problem with gay adoption, as long as, like, I'm sure I don't really know much about the adoptive system. Um, I'm sure that there are securities in place where it's made sure that essentially the people that are adopt are qualified to adopt and mentally stable, and as long as gay people fit those criteria of being mentally stable and capable and able to provide, I don't really have any problem with homosexuals adopting. So I guess I guess I will say rather disagree on this one. This was the first question in my other live stream, and as I said then to this question, I do not have any problem if other official languages are added or replace the already existing official language in my country. The problem that I have with this is that language is something that's really fundamental to culture, that ties people together, and if the language in the country can just be anything, there's no official language, then people are less likely to act and identify as a community, and then you have a less stable country that's less likely to work for the interests of its citizens, because the citizens of the country don't really identify with the country by and large. And so I absolutely disagree with that. The categories men and women are social constructs and should be given up. Well, I think that gender is a social construct, but gender also has its origin in sex, right? When, for example, when we think of women, we think of people with breasts, for example. When we think of people with long hair, for example, and like there's painted fingernails, there's many characteristics, like they have certain hands. There's many other characteristics you could say that women have, besides them only having breasts, like facial characteristics, so on and so forth. And so yes, this is a social construct, but it's socially constructed out of something that is innate, right? It's inherent. And so constructs that should be given up. Well, I don't really see the utility in giving up on these categories. I think that these categories of men and women, of women being, for example, homemakers and taking care of children, and all of these things are probably valuable to society, and mothers. And men going out and doing heroic things like fighting in war and dying on the battlefield, and bravery. I think that these characteristics are desirable and necessary in society. Like, if you don't have people that are willing to fight for the society, then then that society will seldom survive and thrive, and will probably just be conquered by someone else that has a stronger ideology in terms of believing in strength and believing in bravery and believing in these virtues. And in the same way, like, a society won't thrive unless you have value the characteristics of being a mother, because procrastination and maintaining birth rates and all of these things is completely essential to maintaining a society. And so I will have to say that I absolutely disagree with this. Prisons should no longer exist. Well, what is the alternative? That is the first question that comes to mind. I have never met someone that believes that prisons should no longer exist, because if you have violated someone else's rights, whether they are given by government or by God or by something else entirely, um, usually when you have violated someone else's rights, that means that now your own rights are forfeit, right? And you are not entitled to anything. And so that is something that I have a massive problem with in my country, for example. Anders Behring Breivik in my country, which is the most famous mass murderer from my country, killed 70 kids. And he has an Xbox and a PlayStation, and he has internet and contact with the outside world, and all of these things. And I don't feel like he's entitled to any of those things. And so I absolutely disagree that prisons shouldn't exist. Like the alternative is complete anarchy, where you just have all of these criminals doing mayhem in society. That, or since anything goes, like you just have massive dueling and people shooting each other, and essentially citizens arrest, and like these types of things. And so you will probably have massive blood feuds unless you have that type of law and order and enforcement. Like if someone stole something and didn't go to prison, and if someone can kill someone and doesn't go to prison, what stops someone from killing someone that steals something, even, right? Which is like a bit extreme, right? Especially if they're not personally in danger. And so I absolutely disagree that prisons should no longer exist. People need to stand up for their ideals, even if it leads them to betray their country. I answered this question as well on the previous live stream, and it is beyond me why anyone would fight for a country that they do not ideologically identify with. So, for example, if Norway was communist, I would probably not be very inclined to fight for Norway, because that is not aligned with my ideals at all. So, I would rather disagree on this one. Sexual orientation is a social construct. This is also a question from the previous live stream, and as I said then, I think that there are aspects to sexuality that are innate. For example, women seem to be more sexually malleable than men. An example of this is women that are shown lesbian porn are aroused by that, while men that are shown gay porn are generally not aroused by that, but disgusted by that. But there are also like massive things, like for example, people that are trans. Not that trans is necessarily sexual by nature. Like if you're autistic, you're essentially 6 times more likely to be trans, and so there's definitely some amount of like a social construct there, or a social enforcement, and we see that all the time, where people that are essentially socially ostracized and isolated, like people with autism, for example, that might have it hard socially, do things that are rather extreme, either politically or sexually. And so, for those reasons, I believe I will say somewhat agree. It is necessary to remove regulations in labor legislation to encourage firms to hire. Um, so this is also one of the questions from the previous live stream. Um, as I said then, if you have stricter labor protection laws, companies are less inclined to hire because um, because they take way more on the risk if they can't fire you. So they will be really inclined to really find someone that fits the description and what they want. And so if you want people to rapidly hire, and especially hire people that don't have any job experience, you want to have as few labor protection laws as possible, right? But at the same time, you want to have a certain level of labor protection laws where people are guaranteed that, for example, they don't have to work more than a certain amount of working hours against their will, and they're guaranteed a certain level of pay and respect. Um, uh, but it seems to be a big problem today because over time firms have been more and more inclined to hire, like they're less and less inclined today to hire, for example, young people. That is why we have a massive youth unemployment rate. In my country of Norway, I believe that the youth unemployment rate is as high as 20%. And in many countries, it is worse. I think in some countries, it is as high as 40%. Um, and so it might be desirable to remove some labor protection laws in order to encourage more hiring. Um, so I will say somewhat agree. The labor market enslaves workers. Um, like I think that also depends on like what country you're in. In some countries, if you do not work, you die. Right? You can you won't be able to eat. You won't be able to live somewhere to pay rent, and you will die. Um, and um, but like in countries like Norway, I think people have a great deal of freedom. They have a great deal of personal freedom, where essentially, by and large, to a huge margin, they can choose whether they want to take a job or not, and they don't necessarily need a job to survive. So you can say that if someone is it's necessary for someone to take a job out of their own survival. That is a sense of enslavement in a way, because you have no freedom in that decision. You are in a sense coerced to work. Um, but it's difficult to call it enslavement. Um, so I I will rather disagree. Violence against individuals is never productive. Again, this goes into a lot of what I talked about earlier about how I believe that violence is bad. I don't think that it creates anything productive. Like, I think that there's stats on this even where, for example, work environments where someone is abused by their boss, they are verbally abused, or maybe even physically abused, they are far less likely to be able to work at a high level of proficiency. And so it doesn't seem that violence in terms of employer onto employee, or like in general society, is productive. I think that a lot has also changed. Like in the 1930s, political violence, if that's the type of violence we're talking about, was commonplace. In today's society, I think that violence, generally speaking, is looked upon as something really abhorrent. And so, since the political landscapes changed, it's very hard to say that violence is productive. Um, so I will absolutely agree. It's important that health should stay a public matter. Um, I think that that really depends on what type of resources your country has. If if your country has an abundance of resources and are capable of providing the best levels of care publicly, then absolutely yes. But as I've kind of talked about previously, the current level of welfare won't be maintainable forever. Um, because of the demographic changes, larger and larger subsets of the population is elderly, and as a result, many of the welfare policies that exist today will no longer be maintainable. Um, and as the healthcare policy becomes less and less maintainable, it is likely going to be more and more privatized, since governments can't really keep up with the needs of its citizens in terms of health. And so while I would like to see the state keep on providing healthcare forever, it doesn't seem like the pragmatical solution, or like this will be possible unless we have massive levels of automation. Um, so I will somewhat agree, because I agree in principle. I agree that it should be a public matter in principle, but in praxis, it might not be possible. State run companies should be managed like private ones and follow the logic of the market, competition, profitability. So, this is essentially new public management, which was very popular under Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and so on and so forth, where huge sectors of the economy that was public, like the telecom companies, many oil refining companies, and so on and so forth in the UK, for example, became private over time and sold to private actors by the state. I don't really believe that this is beneficial unless it is an industry that is of a net loss to the state, and that is not beneficial for the state, for the citizens, that is in the state's hands. So an industry like this in my country of Norway could be something like the transportation industry, where that is a net loss to the government, um, and and it costs a tremendous amount of money to maintain the rail work and the railways in Norway. Um, uh, and if the private market, let's say, could do that at a profit, where prices do not increase for the consumers, and they could do it at a lower cost with the same level of quality, that would absolutely be desirable. But when it comes to things like healthcare, like things that are more essential, healthcare, education, I believe that these things should be run by the government. And when there's things that are massively profitable, like natural resources, like oil refining, or things like phosphate or gold or iron or zinc, or like all of these different things, or all of these elements, I believe that that should be run by the state, or you should be run like the private market. Again, healthcare, education. So I will absolutely disagree. Social differences between ethnic groups cannot be explained by biology. Um, I will not answer this question and just say absolutely agree. Conditions of life in jails should be greatly improved. So, again, like I am from Norway, which has some of the greatest jail conditions in the world, where people are, for example, entitled to visits from their girlfriends monthly, and where you're entitled to Xbox, we're entitled to all of these different things. And although Norway has some of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, I don't believe that someone that has killed someone is allowed, like, really should be allowed to have this type of quality of life. Would you really want someone that has killed your son, killed your daughter, to have this quality of life? So I think there is a certain quality of life that should be guaranteed, but they should not be living as if they were living in a hotel. They should be expected to do work. They should be expected to do things that they do not want to do, because the response, I think the point of justice is not only rehabilitation. I think it's also punishment. My belief of what justice ultimately is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And although that may not be efficient in creating great results in society, I think that what is justice ultimately is. And I think that you want to balance these different things, where you want to have justice, but at the same time, you want to do the thing that has the most amount of utility. And so from an American perspective, I would absolutely agree with this question. I would think that the conditions in American prisons are terrible, and they should absolutely be improved. In South America, they're terrible. They should absolutely be improved. In my country, I absolutely disagree. So because of those reasons, I will say somewhat agree. Preserving non-urban ecosystems is more important than creating jobs. So this goes back to what I talked about earlier. Sometimes I believe that nature should make way for people. And therefore, like, again, depending on what type of nature your country has to take up. Like, if your country is very urbanized and has very little nature, it's probably not recommendable that you go into and build on the little amount of nature that you have. But if you have our country like Norway, that again have built on maybe 2% of the land, I think it's completely justifiable to essentially go into those ecosystems and build more, so that so that you can create more productivity and more jobs. Absolutely. And so I will absolutely agree with that. I think I need a break. So let's see. How do I take a break? Hmm. Hmm. And we're back. Okay. So, transgender individuals will never really be of the gender they identify as. So, this goes back to what I talked about earlier, because there's many different definitions of what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. Of course, you have the material definition, which is that you either have XX chromosome or XY chromosome, or it is the ideological definition, where whether you are a man or a woman is a sum of different character traits, right? Or it's the metaphysical definition, where it means that you essentially have the soul or the essence of being a man or a woman, right? Which is why, for example, in countries, I think it's Iran or Iraq, where they actually allow for you to transition from male to female, because they believe that someone can, for example, have the soul of a woman and in a man's body, right? And therefore they need to transition. And and so, like, when it comes to the material definition, transgender people will absolutely never be the gender that they wish to be. When it comes to the ideological definition, someone can, for example, fit the general character traits of a woman. Like, for example, when I see someone like Blair White, I would say that she looks like a woman, right? To me, like, to me, she seems to be a woman. And I think that the ideological definition, generally speaking, has a lot of utility in society, because because you can't, for example, check whether someone is a man or a woman before you interact with them. Like, for example, are you going to check someone every time you talk to them, whether they have an XX chromosome or XY chromosome? Like, it has a lot more utility to say, hey, look at that man, or hey, look at that woman. And so I think that transgender individual can pass for the gender that they identify as. But I'm not sure that that is something that most trans women or most trans men do. So I will rather disagree with that. I am equally concerned about the inhabitants of my country as those of the other countries. No, absolutely not. I think that this is also a question that I answered previously in the previous live stream, where I am much more concerned. For example, if someone dies down the street from where I live, than if, for example, someone dies in Ghana, right? So we feel that type of kinship with the people that we're close to us, and the people that live in our communities. And so I care a great deal more about the people that live in my country than those that live, half the way across the world in some other country. And so I will absolutely disagree with that. No one should get rich from owning a business, housing, or land. This is also a question that I went into previously. I think that it's okay to get rich owning a business. I do not think it's okay getting rich owning housing. And I think it's okay getting rich owning land. If you want the full explanation for that, watch the other live stream. So I will rather disagree. Borders should eventually be abolished. Um, I don't really see any utility in abolishing borders. I think that borders exist for a reason, because people that live in different countries have different identities, different cultural identities, different languages. They have different economic backgrounds, and so on and so forth. And so I really don't know what the point of abolishing borders would be. Um, it doesn't seem to have any utility to me. And again, like people work harder when they work in communities where people that they identify with, where people that have the same culture as them. Um, and so, if you just let anyone come into your country willy nilly, it will create this type of delusion where people become really delusional about the state and the government because they can no longer identify with the vast majority of the state, and they become more prone to do things like tax evasion, for example. And so, I will absolutely disagree with that. The state should be abolished. Uh, well, I am not an anarchist. Um, I believe that generally speaking, the state is good. Um, and if you abolish the state, like humans, we have a tendency to organize in larger and larger structures. So let's say that all states that exist today were abolished. What I believe would happen naturally is that larger and larger organizations would just start forming over time, and you would see a re-emergence of states. Um, because that is what we naturally do. It starts with the family, and then the family grows, and the tribe grows over time, and then the institutions of that tribe become larger and larger and takes on more and more functions as it grows. Um, and so I absolutely disagree that the state should be abolished. It would just lead back to a state, in my opinion. Looking for one's own profit is healthy for the economy. Um, well, if people could not pursue their own profit when working in a job or working in a company, um, they would be far less inclined to do any work at all. Like I believe that there's a study on this called the Laffer curve. If you tax someone, I believe it's above 50%, they are far more likely to do things like tax evade. And it also depends on, for example, if they feel like they get something back for their taxes. It seems that universal welfare seems to be more efficient, essentially, than kind of specific welfare where you help those that are in most need. Because if, for example, someone pays into the state and you have a UBI, universal basic income, then the people that pay the taxes feel like they get something back for it, and so UBI is actually not helping most the poor. The poor is not very satisfied with UBI. The people that the UBI helps the most is the middle class. Um, um, and so if people were not looking for their own profit, um, they would probably hesitate to grow anything in the economy. So I absolutely agree. My religion must be spread as widely as possible. So I'm agnostic, and I'm a Nordic pagan. I'm a part of a Nordic pagan organization, and so I don't really feel the need for more people to be religious, or be part of the religious organization that I'm a part of. Would it be nice if more people partook in the pagan traditions and were a part of that religion? Absolutely. I would welcome anyone that wanted to practice that form of culture with me, I think it's desirable in a sense, if more people believed in that. But it's nothing that I have any great desire to spread, or what is by any means what is important to me. Nor do I really wish to spread it beyond the borders of Norway, for example, or into the rest of the world. And so I will have to rather disagree with this. Dismissals of employees should be forbidden except if it's justified. Well, the thing is, you can justify virtually anything. Like, how do you justify the dismissal of an employee? Like, maybe you feel like they're working less. Maybe like you can justify it by any means. Uh, I I feel like firing individuals is something that should be easier. It makes for a more dynamic economy where you have greater redistribution of labor. For example, if in one field they are really overcrowded in terms of labor, and then in another field they lack for labor, then it's very easy to dismiss those people so that they can be allocated into other fields where they might be more suited. Um, and it's like, what does justified mean? What is a justified reason? Like, is it justified if your profits is down this quarter? When is it justified? Um, uh, of course, there should also be some amount of labor protection laws. Um, so I guess um, I somewhat agree. Justice should always take into consideration the context and the past of the condemned, and adapt their penalty accordingly. I do think that if someone, let's say, has committed crimes, they're a repeat offender, they should probably be harsher punished. But that comes with like a huge caveat, and that is that again, the state does what is necessary in the phases leading up to them being reintroduced in society. But if someone essentially is repeat offender despite the best efforts of the state in order to reintroduce this individual into society, they should definitely be punished more harshly. Um, and so I guess I would. Um, uh, there should also be a ground floor in terms of how harshly someone can be punished for a crime. So let's say that you commit a tax fraud. What you might expect would be from 4 to 8 years. So the first time you commit tax fraud, for example, you might get 4 years, and if you repeat the offense, then you should probably be looking at more time. So then you might be looking at closer to 8 years. So it's also with the caveat that there is a ground floor for the penalty, but there should be some wiggle room. So I will somewhat agree to that. Hacking has a legitimate place in a political struggle. Well, it doesn't have a legitimate place in a democratic political struggle. That kind of undermines the whole purpose of democracy if someone can forge votes out of nothing. So I wouldn't say that it's legitimate in that way. If you could hack and change votes that way, right? Then it's no longer really a democracy. It's just whoever has the more skilled hackers win. And in terms of democratic political struggle, absolutely not. But if you're like more realpolitik and you're an authoritarian government, it might just be like one section of the party dictatorship's will against another part of the party dictatorship's will, and then it's like anything goes. You have to play by what is available to you. So I feel very strongly inclined to say absolutely disagree here, although I could be persuaded to say rather disagree. But being from a democracy, it doesn't seem that hacking has a legitimate place in political struggle. Selfishness is the overriding drive in the human species, no matter the context. So this is one of the questions as well that I answered in the previous live stream. So go and watch that live stream if you'd like a longer answer for that question. So I will just absolutely agree. Armed struggle in a country is sometimes necessary. Well, again, like if you're not willing to defend your ideals, in an armed struggle with your life, then those ideals will ultimately succumb to ideals that value things like bravery and sacrifice, and these virtues more. This is a massive problem in many Western countries today because they have a massive lack for recruits in the many militaries in the countries in the West, and that is probably because many people no longer identify with the various Western countries or no longer find them worth dying for. And so if you want to preserve what your country is, you absolutely have to be willing to struggle for it, sometimes with your life at risk. So I will absolutely agree to that. It's unfair to set a minimal penalty for an offense or crime. No, I believe that there should be a ground floor from which you get punished, no matter who you are. You shouldn't get away with doing a crime. And so, like, if you do tax fraud, like our example earlier, yeah, you should absolutely be expecting 4 years, for example, or 2 years, or what is a good punishment for tax evasion. I guess it would depend on how long you've done tax evasion and so on and so forth, right? So from let's say 1 year to 8 years. I don't think that that is unreasonable. And so I will absolutely disagree. There should be a ground level to what type of penalty you get for an offense or a crime. In some specific conditions, the death penalty is justified. So, going back to the case of Breivik in my country that killed 70 kids, this is a man that will never be rehabilitated. He doesn't even regret killing all of those kids. And this is definitely someone that should, is deserving of the death penalty, I believe. But it comes with the caveat that there has to be indisputable proof that the person that is charged with the crime really committed that crime. If there's not indisputable proof, meaning video evidence of that person committing that crime, for example, then I do not believe that they should be sentenced to death for that crime until it is proven that they have that level of evidence that justifies a death penalty. It should be a really, really high evidence requirement for a death penalty to be justified. But in cases like with Breivik, yeah, no, he should absolutely be killed for what he did, especially since he also doesn't regret it. So I will absolutely agree. Patents should not exist. Well, one of the things companies do is devote a lot of resources to research. And if you could not patent what essentially you create in the research of your company, then companies would be a lot less inclined to do research because there's absolutely no benefit of them being of them doing all this research. And so I believe that patents have to exist, but they don't necessarily have to exist forever. So I think that at some point, just like with intellectual property, patents should probably enter the public domain. And this has been a problem lately with for the first time now, Mickey Mouse is in the public domain. And because Disney, whenever Mickey Mouse has been about to enter the public domain, has changed the public domain laws of the United States. And at a certain point, these things don't belong to an individual or a corporation, but they belong to the society and the people of that society, because it's a part of all of their lives. And when a patent or an intellectual property, an IP, enters into the public domain, what usually happens is an explosion in terms of like fan art and character creation and all of these things around this thing, because now people can customize this product or this character however they want. And so I will have to absolutely disagree that patents should not exist. But maybe patents should not exist forever. The right to be anonymous on the internet should be guaranteed. So, I think that anonymity, anonymity, I'm saying it wrong, being anonymous on the internet is something that creates kind of unfortunate situations, because when people are allowed to be completely anonymous, they can essentially be as foul and as savage as they want to be. They can be sociopathic and terrible to other people. On the other hand, there might be some sense of you know um, value in being anonymous, because now you might be able to discuss problems that you weren't before able to discuss. Um, like, for example, if someone has a sexual fetish, and um, they can be anonymous. Now they can talk about that with someone else, and maybe find out what type of problems they have, instead of being so isolated. And so it can be good in that sense. The only problem with being anonymous online is that it can cause, again, serious harm to other individuals, because there's no repercussions for individuals that are anonymous unless they are tracked down. And as long as people um, are polite and civil and don't cause harm, I don't have any problem with them being anonymous. But the problem with internet anonymity comes in when you have people that aren't playing by the rules and are being foul and are doing things that are malicious. Um, and so I do think that these things shouldn't be completely guaranteed, but pretty guaranteed. Um, uh, so I will say somewhat agree. It is acceptable that some industry sectors are private. Um, I think I answered this question in the previous live stream. And I think that is not only acceptable, but I think that is actually desirable for some industries to be private, because private industry can drive innovation in a completely different way than what you could if you just had a public industry. So when you have a state-planned economy, for example, in a communist country, and you have, for example, let's say a state Walmart, that state Walmart doesn't have any reason to evolve into being a state Amazon, and becoming a more efficient way of distribution. Or if it's Blockbuster, that doesn't have any reason to evolve into becoming the Netflix. And so the private market has a level of efficiency that the public market doesn't, because if you have something that is completely public sector, then that won't be as good as at challenging itself to innovate. And as I've also said before, groups are better at individuals are better at taking on risk than groups. So for those reasons, I'm for private enterprise. Environmental norms should be influenced by mass consumption and not from an authority. Um, I think I answered this question in the previous live stream. Um, and I do think that voting with your dollar, so to speak, to drive these things is an efficient way of driving consumptions and getting companies to do the things that you want them to do. But it doesn't seem that consumer pressure alone is enough to change consumption to the level of what many environmentalists would like to see. Um, um, so I will say somewhat agree. Some sectors or type of employment should be financially supported. Yes, this is also one of the questions that I answered in the previous live stream. So, for example, things like farming, for example, that is essential um, to um, to a country's existence, should absolutely be subsidized by the government, because when you have a globalized economy like we have today, there are countries that to a huge extent specialize in certain goods. But when those countries are under threat or being attacked, they're not being able to produce things to the extent of which the international market would like. So, for example, Ukraine, during the invasion of Ukraine, is not able to produce as much wheat as it was before the invasion of Ukraine. Um, and because of that, some countries are running into shortages of wheat, um, and which is one of the reasons why you should strive to be self-efficient in certain fields, because you never know when these things will occur in the market, where there will kind of be these type of massive shortages. And for some things that are essential like food, the government should absolutely try to guarantee that for its people if crises do occur. um, so I absolutely agree. Minimal levels of salary should be ensured to make sure that worker can live off their work. Um, I do believe that people should be able to live off their work, um, but having a minimum wage might not guarantee that, because when you have a minimum wage, what can happen is, if your society doesn't produce enough, is that you just run into problems of inflation. So, for example, if everyone on McDonald's is paid $25 an hour, then now prices of hamburgers went up. So they're now double or triple price. And so people's lives do not really like the value of their life in terms of how much they have doesn't necessarily increase, because um, because this increase in wages just leads to inflation, which leads them to be exactly in the situation that they were before the rise in wages. As well as this can discourage hiring, or for companies to hire less. At the same time, believe that workers should be required to make ends meet when they work. Of course, like my country, Norway, is an entirely different situation than many other countries. That where a minimum wage threshold might just lead to larger economic problems. But in countries like mine and industrialized countries, I believe that minimum wage in generally is a good idea. So I absolutely agree with that. It is necessary to implement assemblies to ration our production to the consumers according to their needs. I absolutely disagree. If there is a dip in the market where there is a commodity that is not being produced enough of, then the private market often compensates, and more people move over to the sector where products are needed. So it seems to me that planned economies are only required when there is a severe crisis, like a war, like massive food shortage and stuff like that. That's when government has to step in and make sure that there is enough resources in terms of labor going to the places that they need to be. Um, when it comes to like general society, when society is not in crisis, that level of state planning is not really needed. And this is something that I think is only necessary when countries only go into things like a war economy. That's what you saw during World War II. Virtually every product that was produced by any manufacturer, whether it was Ford, General Motors, anything else, in the United States, for example, went from producing consumer goods to essentially producing military goods, stuff from the military. And all the different materials like gasoline and many of these things in many countries were rationed to only military use. Um, and so that is necessary in a great crisis, but doesn't seem necessary when a country is not in a crisis. Then the market can figure these things out. Um, so I will absolutely disagree. Market economy is optimal when it's not regulated. Well, the problem with a market economy that is not regulated is that a lot of the time what happens is that monopolies form, and monopolies are not efficient for the consumer. So you have many examples of that. You have things like, for example, the maple syrup monopoly in Canada, where essentially they artificially inflate the prices of maple syrup. And if you had competitions in that market, then um, you know uh, there would be there would be a much better situation essentially for the consumer. Um, and there would be lower prices for the consumer. Um, so I will have to absolutely disagree with that. A market economy requires regulation. Okay, I have been here for 2 hours and 10 minutes, so I think I will call it off here for today, and then I will not shut off my computer for part 3. I wish you all a good day. Have a nice one.